You're listening to Desire and Power with your host, Mira Salem.
Hello, everyone. It is New Year's Eve 2025. We are just about to start off the new year. And I got a really big, long podcast for you guys today. And I'm really excited because it was brought up by multiple people that they wanted me to do this episode. So here we are. Today, we're going to talk about modern dating and flakiness in the modern dating culture that we're in right now. And I'm just going to say, before we get into like psychology, research, social media, attachment styles, or any of that, I want to start with my most honest reaction when someone brings up modern dating, okay? My stomach turns. And like, that's not a metaphor, it's a physical response. It's like a low grade disgust mixed with exhaustion, like just the feeling of ugh, right? Just hearing people talk about dating right now makes my body tense. And I want to name that because I don't think I'm alone in that feeling. Modern dating feels so bad in my body. Like it feels shallow, it feels performative, it feels like everyone is trying to get something without really being with anyone. There's a lack of presence, a lack of depth, a lack of integrity that is so freaking palatable that you can feel it within minutes of interacting with somebody. And what really gets me is that it's not subtle anymore. It's like full-blown emotional laziness, disposability, people treating each other like temporary entertainment instead of human beings with nervous systems and histories and, like actual inner lives. That pisses me off. I'm not going to lie. That part really pisses me off because this isn't just inconvenient or annoying. It costs something real for people. It costs time, it costs energy, it costs desire. And personally, at this point in my life, I'm not willing to pay that cost anymore. Now, let's get into the bread and butter of this episode. Here's the thing that people don't talk about enough, right? Flakiness doesn't just waste time in a casual way. It drains people who actually have depth. For me, the cost is very concrete. Like when I go on a date and it's surface level, when somebody can't be present, can't be curious, can't meet me anywhere below small talk, I don't leave feeling neutral. I leave feeling fully freaking depleted. Like I've had dates where I get home and genuinely wish that I had just stayed at home and watched a movie instead. Not because I hate dating, but because the interaction felt so lifeless. No spark, no attunement, no sense that the person across from me had actually spent any time with their own inner world. And that kind of interaction isn't just boring to me, it is full-blown energetically draining for me. People think that flakiness is just about inconsistency or texting habits, but it's so much deeper than that. It's truly about a lack of presence, a lack of willingness to engage, a lack of capacity to actually be with another human being without performing or defaulting to scripts. And at this stage in my life, to me, that really matters because my time isn't empty anymore. My inner life isn't empty. I have work I care about. I have desire that feeds me. I have creative energy. I have a business. I have a body that knows what it wants. So when I sit across from someone who hasn't done any real self-reflection, who doesn't know who they are, who asks the most surface level questions and never goes deeper, it feels like I'm being asked to abandon myself just to be polite. And I'm not willing to do that anymore. That's the part that people miss. Flakiness doesn't just hurt feelings, it quietly teaches people with depth to shut down, to stop trying, or to just, opt out altogether. Not because they don't want connection, but because the cost-benefit ratio just stops making sense. So this is especially brutal if you're somebody who is highly perceptive and emotionally literate or neurodivergent, because if you're good at reading people and recognizing patterns and kind of like sensing what's underneath the surface, you can tell very quickly when someone hasn't done the work. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, You notice their lack of curiosity. You notice the avoidance of emotional risk. When you ask them like deep questions, they just brush it off with like one sentence answer and then move on to the next surface level thing. You see the discomfort that shows up the moment that things like slow down and start becoming real. And the irony is that this isn't about like needing constant conversation, right? Sometimes you can feel depth in silence. Sometimes it's a purely energetic thing. You just have a sense that the person who is, sitting across from you has a relationship with their own inner world. There's just a presence that they bring when they have that. And when that's missing, there's no amount of texting or effort that can compensate for that. And if someone listening right now is saying like, oh shit, I've been the flaky one, you're going to hear my honest answer to that at the end of this episode. So here's what I actually want to be really clear about, because it's easy to turn this into a moral judgment, and that's really not useful. Most flaky people are not malicious, right? They're not sitting there plotting how to waste your time. They're not consciously trying to hurt you or hurt anybody. What's usually happening is much simpler and much harder to face. A lot of people just genuinely do not have the capacity for depth. And I don't mean intelligence in the academic sense. I mean emotional and relational capacity, the ability to sit with discomfort, the ability to stay present when things get uncertain, the ability to tolerate vulnerability without immediately escaping. You can feel this pretty much right away when you're talking to somebody, they've never really examined themselves. They've never spent time alone. They don't read. They don't reflect. They don't have language for what they feel. They're just carrying a lot of unresolved shit, but it's all buried under distraction and coping mechanisms. Right. And then you have the other category, right? People who do have depth, but are absolutely terrified and scared shitless of it. And these are people that have been hurt, right? People that have gone through really bad breakups, betrayal, abuse, emotional chaos. Unfortunately, though, instead of metabolizing those experiences, they just learn to avoid anything that might bring those feelings back online. Right? So when they meet somebody with depth, somebody who's present and embodied and emotionally aware, it doesn't feel comforting. It feels fucking threatening, because depth collapses fantasy, and fantasy is where a lot of people live, like most people, right? Fantasy's safe, right? Fantasy's secure. It's controllable. It doesn't ask anything of you. You can basically project whatever you want onto someone, and as long as you don't get close enough to actually see them, then all is well. But the moment that real connection starts to form, reality shows up, and reality is messy. It requires accountability. It requires consistency. It requires showing up even when it's uncomfortable. And that's usually the moment that people disappear in modern culture. I really think this is one of the core dynamics of modern flakiness. People say they want connection, they say they want intimacy, they say they want love, but what they often want is the idea of those things without the actual lived experience of them. Because real intimacy brings up your shit, okay? It brings up your attachment wounds, it brings up insecurity, past trauma, it brings up responsibility. So instead of moving towards it, people retreat back into fantasy, right? Endless options, endless scrolling, endless novelty, endless maybes. And then the moment that you sense that, somebody expects more than performance, more than like surface level engagement, their nervous system starts to panic, right? That's when people ghost and they pull back, and you get the sudden, well, I don't know what I want. I don't know. When they default to things like situationships. And it's not because they're confused necessarily, but because staying for real connection would require them to grow. Here's where I think a lot of people get genuinely confused. And I mean this compassionately. Okay? I think a huge amount of modern flakiness is people trying to protect what they believe is their freedom. They think that freedom means keeping everything open. They think that freedom means not being tied down, having options and flexibility and escape routes. But that version of freedom is kind of a big misunderstanding, right? Because what most people are actually protecting isn't freedom, it's avoidance. They're protecting themselves from the discomfort of choice, from the vulnerability of commitment, from the reality that once you choose something, you do lose the other possibilities. And yes, that loss is real. Commitment does mean sacrifice. It means you can't be everything everywhere all at once. It means that you're saying no to 1,000 imaginary futures in order to build a real one. But in my eyes, that's not weakness, that's actually power. Somebody articulated this years ago. It was actually Mark Manson, and I read it in his book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And I've read that book 9 times, so that's why I remember this so well. But he had the idea that endless options don't liberate you, they actually trap you. That when everything is possible, nothing becomes meaningful. And you basically just get stuck hovering around life instead of actually inhabiting it. Depth doesn't come from keeping doors open. It only comes from walking through one door and staying there long enough to actually be changed by it. And that applies to relationships, to work, to creative paths, to values, to pretty much everything. But what I see over and over and over again in today's culture is that people are mistaking commitment for limitation, when in reality, commitment is the only thing that creates meaning in life. Now, this part is hard to talk about, but we got to do it. It's important, right? I want to talk about what happens to people over time that don't choose. I have a lot of friends. I know a lot of people. I'm a very social person. And I've seen firsthand what happens to people who spend decades chasing sensation without depth, who just, keep everything casual, who avoid commitment in the name of freedom, and who stay flaky because it feels easier than facing themselves. And unfortunately, what I see again and again and again is depression and numbness. A vague sense that life has no meaning. A constant restlessness that nothing ever actually satisfies, right? I've seen it in my friends. I've seen it in men, especially as they get older, people who spent years floating from connection to connection, always wanting the next hit, the next fantasy, the next possibility. And then one day they look around and realize they don't actually have anything solid. They have no deep partnership, no shared life, no intimacy that's grown over time. And suddenly, the thing that they thought was freedom feels like a cage. And it's not because they're bad people. It's not because they were malicious, but because avoiding commitment also means avoiding the kind of growth that gives life texture and meaning. Now, this is the part that I really want to emphasize. This pattern doesn't just show up in romance. It shows up fucking everywhere. People who won't commit to relationships often don't commit to a place, to a practice, to a craft, to a calling, or to a set of values. They always just freaking stay hovering, just constantly sampling, trying things on without ever letting anything reshape them. And the tragedy is that depth, like real freaking depth, it only emerges through friction, through time, through staying when it could be easier to leave. You cannot experience the full spectrum of love and intimacy or connection without choosing something and allowing it to cost you. And that's not romanticism. That is just the reality of the world that we live in. And if we zoom out far enough, we can see very clearly that modern dating didn't just get bad by accident, okay? We built a freaking culture that actively trains people away from intimacy. Think about where most people spend their time and attention. On their phones, on social media, in algorithm-driven spaces designed to keep them scrolling and reacting and consuming. Short clips, hot takes, meme, 30 seconds of stimulation before the next thing replaces it, right? That's the kind of environment that trains the nervous system to crave novelty, speed, and instant reward. It does not train patience. It does not train presence. It does not train emotional attunement. And it absolutely does not train intimacy. Most people are not sitting with themselves. They're not reflecting. They're not learning how they relate, how they attach, how they protect themselves when they feel vulnerable. They're just literally filling every quiet moment of their lives with stimulation. And most of the time, that stimulation is from their freaking phone. So when intimacy slows things down, right? When it asks for attention and regulation, honesty, their system panics because intimacy doesn't give dopamine the way that scrolling does. It doesn't give instant hits. It requires staying. And that feels intolerable to a system that's been trained to escape discomfort immediately. So this is where I want to talk about something super important. And I know I've taken forever to get here, but I had to give the full, landscape. I want to talk about dopamine-brained dating because this is modern flakiness summed up through actual data. And it's actually where things get brutally simple, okay? When a nervous system is trained on dopamine, it behaves like an addiction. It is an addiction. Not even like it behaves, it is an addiction. As soon as something stops feeling immediately rewarding, the impulse is to leave and find the next hit. Not because the person's evil, but because their system doesn't know how to stay when reward is delayed. So in dating, the moment that things slow down, the moment attraction requires patience, the moment vulnerability replaces intensity, people fucking bounce. Okay? They ghost, they pull back, they reappear randomly like 2 months later. Hey, what are you doing? Right? They keep their options open, they keep the just in case thing going, but it's not mystery, guys. It's conditioning. It is a dopamine trained nervous system that is struggling with depth because depth requires tolerating boredom, uncertainty, and emotional risk. At least at first, But instead of learning that those phases are normal, people are just now assuming that something is wrong and then they move on. This is another huge piece of the puzzle. I'm laying it all out today, okay? Because these are things that we really should be talking about more if we want to fix this really broken culture. A lot of people confuse intensity with intimacy. Fast texting. Oversharing way too much shit way too fast. Hypersexualized interactions before even meeting each other in person. It feels intense, but it's not intimate. Intimacy actually requires slowing down, letting things unfold, allowing silence, allowing the unknown. And in a culture where people are sending explicit photos of their genitalia before they even know each other's last names, slowing down can feel terrifying or like unbearably boring. But slowing down means that, you might have to feel yourself. You might have to sit with your thoughts and your loneliness and your fear. And most people have not been taught how to do that. So all of this conditioning shows up in super predictable ways. We have over texting and then disappearing. We have under texting and then acting confused. We have ghosting. We have situationships. We have inconsistent communication. We have avoiding any kind of clear conversation. We have keeping things vague just in case, right? At the end of the day, you guys know these behaviors. They're different behaviors, but they have the same underlying pattern. Avoiding sustained presence. Again, because presence requires accountability, self-awareness, and it requires sitting the fuck down and shutting up long enough to know who the hell you are. All right. I'm going to share something personal here, and I want to say up front that this part is feeling a little scary to talk about. Now, I'm currently in the early stages of a new relationship. It's new, it's unfolding, there's no guarantees, and I am not sharing this as some kind of romantic success story or proof that I've figured anything out, okay? I'm not. I'm sharing it because it feels relevant to this conversation about flakiness, and because it's vulnerable for me to name that I'm actually choosing to be present with somebody right now. What feels important to say is that this didn't feel different because it was perfect or effortless. It felt different because I kept noticing how I was showing up inside of it. From the very beginning, there was chemistry, like real chemistry. And for me, that's rare. My body doesn't respond like that to just anyone. So I knew pretty quickly that there was something there worth paying attention to. It wasn't just attraction, but it was just something that felt alive to me. What also kind of kept me open from the beginning is the fact that we met in real life. We didn't meet on a dating app because I don't do dating apps. I absolutely despise them and they give me all kinds of ickiness. So the fact that I met somebody in real life was really special for me. Now, instead of scattering my energy, right? Instead of like keeping my options open and doing the whole modern dating bullshit where everything just stays vague, I just made a very conscious choice pretty early on that I was going to stay present with this person that was in front of me. And not because something dramatic happened, like I wasn't trying to force anything. And it was just because it felt honest to keep showing up in that space. And, things have moved really slowly in some ways, maybe quickly in others. We don't see each other constantly. We're good at having time away from each other. In that time, though, we do have consistency. It's not perfection, but it's steadiness, right? We have communication that doesn't disappear. We have a willingness to talk about things that matter without performing or posturing. Another thing that really made me want to stay present from the beginning is the fact that he was very open and honest with me about something that's hard to do. And it was genuinely a moment where I was like, okay, this is an honest human being. This is freaking cool. A lot of people don't show up that way, right? So there's obviously already been moments that have been awkward and uncomfortable, right? There's been moments of uncertainty. There's been moments where my own fear came up, especially because my last relationship ended quite painfully, and this is the first time I've let myself have a real opening since then. And now this part is really important because I want to say that when those fears came up for me, my work here is the fact that I had to recognize that they were mine, right? Like not his. I didn't put anything on him. He did nothing wrong. I just obviously going into something new at 37 years old, you're going to have old triggers. You're going to have old wounds. You're going to have old stories that are going to be trying to protect you. And it's kind of your responsibility to be aware of that, right? I had to sit with them instead of acting them out. And that's work. And I've been doing this work for a long time. So it comes a little bit easier to me now. But there's a lot of people who die without ever having done that work. And unfortunately, when you don't do that work, you don't really get to wonder why things are falling apart. And I know that's kind of harsh, but we do have to take responsibility for ourselves. And that's part of not being flaky, and that's part of showing up. And yeah, like what made this feel different wasn't that it was easy. It was that neither of us disappeared when things felt a little vulnerable. There was space to show stress. There was space to show low moods. There was space for being human. And that was really important to me. It felt like, okay, this is something I can actually build on. And I could feel that this connection would require my presence. It would require accountability, honesty, and, instead of feeling like that's going to be a threat, it actually just felt like something I was willing to meet. So I didn't like choose to stay after something went wrong. I just kept choosing not to leave, right? That's a choice. I kept choosing not to look anywhere else, and I kept choosing to grow one connection instead of chasing many. So I'm sharing this not because I know how it's going to end. I don't. But because this is what non-flaky dating actually looks like in real life, right? It's not flashy. It's not dramatic. It's not a performance. It's just staying open, staying present, and letting something unfold without running the moment that things get a little uncomfortable. Now, I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to start to kind of close this down and give you some of my final thoughts. This is the part that I'm going to say some stuff that might piss off some people and maybe that some people don't want to hear. But genuinely, if you open up to this, I think it could save you or save them years of frustration. You guys need to hear this. I'm sorry, but I'm saying it. Most people who are flaky don't need better communication scripts, okay? They don't need dating strategies. They don't need to learn how to text more effectively. They just need to stop fucking dating. Stop dating completely. Like, not forever, but for long enough to actually figure out who the fuck you are when no one is choosing you, desiring you, validating you, or giving you a sense of direction. Sorry, that's the truth. Because a huge amount of modern dating chaos comes from people who genuinely do not know themselves. They don't know what they want. They don't know what they're capable of committing to. And they're not evil. They're not broken. They're just very much under-examined by themselves. And dating, especially casual dating, makes that a lot worse. Because sex, attention, novelty, and romantic possibility all act like emotional noise, and they add they add this cloudiness to your self-awareness, right? Where you just can't see. You get this illusion that something is happening when nothing is actually integrating. So people bounce from connection to connection. They never stop long enough to notice patterns. They never stop long enough to ask, like, why do I always pull away? Why do I lose interest the moment that something becomes real? Why do I feel trapped when somebody actually wants me? Why do I feel why do I need constant novelty to feel alive? Like, those are not questions that you can answer while you're actively dating. You have to be alone for that shit. Every person I know who has taken a real break from dating, like not a few weeks, not a soft break, but like a real measurable stretch of time. If you guys are going to press me for an actual number, I'm going to say minimum of a year. Minimum. Right? But every person I know who's done that, they come back changed. And like, not more perfect, not magically healed or shit like that, but clearer. Okay? They know what drains them now. They know what excites them. They know what they're no longer willing to tolerate. They figured out the difference between desire and validation. They know what kind of connection actually nourishes them versus like what basically just feeds their ego or their anxiety or just makes them not feel alone momentarily. But most importantly, they learn how to frickin' sit with themselves. That's the skill that almost no one has anymore. The ability to be alone without immediately reaching for stimulation, sex, attention, or distraction. The ability to feel boredom, loneliness, grief, desire, and restlessness without trying to frickin' outsource those feelings to another human being. That's where emotional capacity gets built. You don't develop relational depth by constantly being in relationships. I know that sounds weird, but that's the honest truth. You can only develop it by understanding yourself outside of one. So when someone who's done the work re-enters dating, the whole game changes because they're not chasing, they're not auditioning, they're not forcing chemistry where it doesn't exist, right? They can just feel misalignment early and walk away without the drama. They can feel attraction without needing to act on it. They can say no without guilt. They can choose one person without feeling like they're missing out on other people. And that's when flakiness disappears. Imagine what the dating world would be like if everyone just took a year off to do this kind of work and then came back. You know? The sad part is that a lot of people just don't realize this until much later in life, right? That's honestly where it gets sad. Because they spend years protecting their freedom, keeping everything open, avoiding commitment, chasing sensation instead of depth, and then over time that avoidance just hardens into numbness. You see it in people who feel empty, who feel unfulfilled, and who feel like life never quite landed for them. And they're not unhappy because they chose wrong people. They're unhappy because they never chose anything long enough to let it change them. And like I said earlier, this doesn't just apply to dating, it applies to work, to creativities, to values, and to meaning in general. You do not build a life by keeping all your doors open. You build a life by choosing which doors you're willing to walk through and which ones you're willing to let close. Now, if you're listening to this and you're realizing, like, hey, I've been flaky, I've been attracted to flaky people, I don't think the answer is trying harder to date better. I think the answer is just stepping the fuck back, getting honest with yourself, spending time alone, figuring out who you are when nobody is watching. Because desire, intimacy, and connection do not come from optimization, they come from self-knowledge. And flakiness does not disappear when you meet the right person. It disappears when you become someone who can actually stick around. I want to thank you all so much for listening. You guys are great. Even if there's only 1 or 2 or 3 of you right now, one day we're going to be bigger. It's going to be great. But for now, if you want more deep dives into erotic psychology, relationship advice, and shadow work, consider subscribing to my Substack and follow me on all my other socials that I've linked in the show notes.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to hit that follow button to know when the next episode releases.